Thank you all for joining today's webinar on research data management. We hope you will enjoy the experience. We are fully booked with over 300 registered participants. Unfortunately, Birgit can't make it today. She's sick, but will get well very soon, we hope. Today's webinar is jointly organized by LIBER Steering Committee, Scholarly Communication and Research Infrastructures. Participants are muted during this webinar, so please use the chat to post your questions and comments, and we will come back to these after the presentation. The overall duration of the webinar will be about 40 to 45 minutes. There will be recordings of the webinar, and the recording will be made available via the LIBER website. Today's webinar will provide a sneak preview on the progress and first outcomes of the FAIR Data Expert Group, and we very much look forward to hear Simon's and Sarah's report on the guidance of FAIR Data Action Plan, which the group is creating in collaboration with the research data community. Today's speakers are Simon Hodson. Simon Hodson is the Executive Director of CODATA since 2013. Simon is an expert on data policy issues and research data management. He has contributed to influential reports on current best practice for research data management policies and to the Science International Accord on Open Data in a Big Data World. As part of his CODATA role, Simon leads or is participant in numerous projects, working groups, and steering groups. He's a project director for the African Open Science Platform projects, for example. He's chair of the European Commission's expert group on FAIR data. He's involved in the OECD Global Science Forum on sustainable business models for data repositories, and he's also on the board of directors for the Dryad data repository. Sarah Jones is Associate Director at the Digital Curation Center, the DCC, a service providing best practice and support on research data management and digital curation. She coordinates work on the DCC's data management planning tool, DMP Online, we all know, and undertakes research on data policy and data management planning. She has written several articles and book chapters on these topics and co-edited Delivering Research Data Management Services, Fundamentals of Good Practice. Sarah provides advisory services, training and consultancy via the DCC and is involved in the EC-funded project Foster, Open Air and RDA4 projects. Her work in a European context focused primarily on training, data management planning and network building to facilitate open science. I'd now give the floor to Sarah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rob. So as Rob explained, Simon and I are here to talk about this European Commission's expert group on turning FAIR data into reality. I assume most people are familiar with the concept of FAIR already, but we thought it's worth just doing a very quick definition before we wade into the work we've been doing. So the notion of FAIR emerged from Force 11. It's a set of principles that describe the attributes that data need to have to enable and enhance their reuse. So they need to have metadata and identifiers to be findable. The data should be accessible and interoperable and reusable by others. And that's by humans and machines. So it's thinking about the broadest reuse possible and using appropriate standards to enable that interoperability. And what the Commission has done, they've set up a group, a FAIR data expert group, and our remit is to think about how we turn that vision, that set of principles into reality. And we've got 4 sections to this talk. I will begin by giving you an introduction to the expert group and our work, our remit, and the progress we've made to date. And then I'll hand over to Simon, who's going to speak about the emerging recommendations and the next steps, so you can think about how you want to engage with us in the future. So there are a number of members to the FAIR Data Expert Group. Simon Hodson of CODATA is the chair, and I'm acting as rapporteur. And then we have a number of members from different research areas and backgrounds. So Ruta and Peter both come from a kind of linguistics and language data. I think Ruta's involved in LIBER, so coming from the library community, and Peter running data facilities and services, although actually he's just retired, so he's actually been really great at having more time to contribute to the group. Daniel Meechan is an open science advocate and comes from a biophysics background. Françoise Geneva is working in astronomy in France. Leif Lachansson is at the CSC IT Centre based in Finland. So here we've got the high performance computing kind of context coming in. And then Natalie and Sandra have both been involved in the group for 1 year. So Sandra was involved in the first year of the group, but when our remit and group was extended, she wasn't able to continue. So Natalie Harrower joined us this year, and she's from the Digital Repository of Ireland. So she's bringing a kind of humanities context into our work. So this is the set of objectives that we had. There were 5 areas the Commission wanted us to provide some work on. The core remit is to develop recommendations on what needs to be done to turn each component of FAIR into reality. And we're to address that on 3 different levels, to the EC, to member states, and on an international level. And one point to clarify here in how we're actually addressing this, we're not breaking up FAIR into those component parts. We're not having a section of the report on findability and accessibility, because we find that there's a lot of overlap between those concepts. So we're really addressing this holistically as in terms of what needs to be done for FAIR as a whole. We also need to propose indicators so we can measure the progress and we can track change over time. And then we need to provide input to the European Open Science Cloud Action Plan. And there's a parallel group being run by Silvana on, it's the second EOS high-level expert group, and we're working in collaboration with them. The Commission wanted us to provide some specific feedback on the evaluation of the Horizon 2020 Data Management Plan and their plans for discipline-specific guidance on that. And then the final aspect is about the costing and financing of data management activities. And you can see these details online at the link at the bottom there. We've also been extended. So we initially were to run for a year with that remit that I've just shown, but then we were extended into the end of this year, and that's so we could contribute more directly into the FAIR Data Action Plan. So the Commission wants an action plan to guide its work over the coming years, and we're developing that as part of our report. So all of the recommendations that come out of our report, at the moment we're developing these into a very concrete plan of action for ongoing work. We'll also be doing consultation around that action plan, so we're to do workshops with various experts from European and international interoperability initiatives so they can contribute into the plan. And then we'll launch and disseminate the plan and support the Commission's communications around this towards the end of this year in November. So this is the timescale we're working to. We've drafted the report, but we're currently going through doing the edits so we can publish an interim report that's due at the end of May. And that will be launched at the EOS Summit on the 11th of June in Brussels. And then we have a few months consultation period. We'll be running a workshop actually at the EOS Summit where we consult specifically on the action plan. And we do want to hold other webinars and stakeholder events over the summer. And we would welcome your input to define what's the best fora to engage in and what kind of activities people want to get involved in there. And then in terms of the release of the final report that's due in November, there'll be an official launch at the Austrian presidency events in Vienna. So that's a bit of background to the group. I just want to talk about the progress to date, and then I'll hand over to Simon. So obviously we've drafted the report. We started off by developing a kind of skeleton framework, and we've iterated that a little bit over time, but these are the sections we've ended up with. So we begin with an explanation of the concepts, so the origins of FAIR, what it means to be fair, some aspects that maybe could do to be enhanced or made a little bit more explicit. And then we have the two main sections of the report, one about creating the culture of fair data, so thinking about the kind of research communities and their practices and how we enable FAIR within those, and also creating a technical ecosystem for FAIR, so all of the supporting services and technology and standards that are needed. And we're really seeing these two aspects as two halves of one whole. We also address skills and capacity building, both in terms of the research community, but also the data stewards and curators. And we have a section on measuring change, where we're looking at the metrics and the rewards that are needed to actually provoke this culture change towards FAIR. And then the final section is really on how we facilitate this, and this is where the action plan comes in. We ran a consultation last summer. When we'd started to draft the report, we pulled together a number of ideas and questions for each section that we were planning to work on. And we ran a consultation to encourage people to feed in and point us to useful references or projects or approaches. And we did that in two ways. We had a number of webinars that were moderated by different group members, and we also had a GitHub site where anyone could feed in. And we got a lot of contributions, so if you were involved in that, many thanks. And we've used those to feed into the writing of the report. The other thing we've done, we've run a survey on the Horizon 2020 data management plan. We did this in collaboration with OpenAir, and the survey was open for a few months last summer. And it asked about attitudes to data management plans, and specifically the Horizon 2020 template and support. And we had just short of 300 responses. These were roughly half researchers and half support staff, or people who identified as both categories. And all of the data from this is available on Zenodo, the report with the dataset and the infographic. And we also did a webinar, so you can hear a lot more about this specific report through that. But some of the key findings, overall, it was actually really positive to see that most people found the process of writing a DMP beneficial. So 60% identified as positive there. And the majority of people understood the concept of fair data. So 74% had agreed there, but they found the practical implementation difficult, and that's really the core remit of our group, to try and make that putting FAIR into practice a bit easier. There were some specific issues with the Horizon 2020 guidelines, so people struggled with the process of making updates or understanding how the reviewing was done or how to cost in data management. And they also made some specific recommendations about what they're looking for from tools. So really, they're looking for a much more tailored experience. They want tools to suggest relevant standards given the field or data type, to have more drop-down options or examples, or discipline-specific guidance, which is something the Commission specifically wants to create, or to recommend repositories. And the other thing that was really positive out of this survey, almost half would openly publish their DMP. And knowing that, I think, really enables us to think about how we can use the content of DMPs more usefully. Because if that content's open, we can make people aware of data that's being created earlier, and we can also use it to inform other services. So there are a number of recommendations that came out of that specific report. We're using these to inform our expert group work, but we're also going beyond this because this is focused very much around the Commission's template. And we're trying to think in a broader context about how a data management plan can be part of that wider ecosystem of fair data and supporting services, and what role it can play to really help connect up and to make data fair. So this is informing our work, but we're going a little bit beyond it in our report recommendations as well. And then the final point I wanted to flag before handing on to Simon is about the action plan specifically and how we're structuring that. The main aim is to have very short recommendations. We're trying to make them brief enough that they could be tweeted, so it's something you can encapsulate in one small point. And then underneath the recommendations, we're having several specific action points on how that recommendation is turned into reality. And those action points are being linked to different stakeholders and timeframes, so we can give some kind of prioritization and flow of how work should progress. The action plan, as our entire report will also apply to the EC member states and the international level. So it has kind of quite a broad framing, but we will also place it in the specific context of EOS and inform their roadmap. So we'll think about how that wider action plan, what specific aspects are relevant for EOS too. And the framing we have, the idea about implementing the action plan, is that the Fair Data Expert Group will come up with a common Fair Data Action Plan, and that will be used as a rubric to support the definition of related Fair Data Action Plans that apply at either a discipline level or at a member state level. And that helps us then go into the specifics of each context, each data type and practice type. This is the aim for our workshop at the EOS Summit on the 11th of June. We want to share our common plan and start in groups to try and define what's relevant in different contexts. So that's all I had to say. I'll mute myself and hand you over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I trust everyone can hear me. I should say Sarah introduced herself as Rapporteur, which is the official title, but we've really been working very much as two co-chairs of this group, so I think it's important to say that. So what I'm going to do in this section is give some, I emphasize some insights into the report and the emerging recommendations. I stress that in the context of a shortish webinar, I'm not going to give a full overview of all the discussions in each section of the report, nor am I going to be excessively concrete in the specific recommendations, because that will be published and it will be there as an interim report for consultation from the end of May. But nevertheless, we are keen to get feedback on our thinking, and so for each section, I'll give some insight and some indication of where we think we're going with the recommendations, and the sort of recommendations that are likely to appear. So it's very much emerging recommendations, and we'll be very keen to have your feedback. As Sarah mentioned, the opening section really deals with the concepts around FAIR, and we make the point very clearly, I hope, that FAIR has really contributed. The idea of FAIR data, the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, that these attributes add to the value and of data for research. That encapsulation and those principles has really moved the debate forward. They've caught the zeitgeist. It's been a very useful rhetorical tool. But we also stress that FAIR still needs to be augmented with additional concepts in a number of ways, which I'll go into. The most obvious is open. So FAIR does not of itself imply and necessitate open. And in fact, the FAIR data principles need to be augmented with this additional maxim, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And it's important to understand that. One of the reasons for this is that FAIR data and the principles can apply equally well to data that is necessarily restricted. For example, data that can only be accessed in certain controlled circumstances, perhaps by accredited researchers, perhaps in data safe havens. And there are, on occasion, very good reasons for such restrictions. However, we insist upon the principle that openness, the open availability of research data, particularly if produced by public funding, open should be the default, and that there should be proportionate exceptions for privacy, commercial interests, public interests, etc. But the point there is that FAIR needs to be augmented with an additional concept. And that also applies, we argue, for additional attributes and principles which aren't necessarily contained in the original core description of the FAIR data principles. I don't know whether people are familiar with Isaiah Berlin's essay, The Fox and the Hedgehog. Bear with me a little bit. This little excursus, I hope, will be enlightening. In that essay, Berlin uses the metaphor of the hedgehog who knows one big thing, how to defend itself with spikes, and contrasts that with the fox who knows lots of little things, who's wily and clever and knows how to break into chicken yards and get through chicken wire or climb over fences or whatever. And he uses that to compare what was at the time known as German or continental idealism, the philosophy of Hegel and Marx, to more empirical philosophies which rely on evidence. That's by the side. I sometimes think that that metaphor, the fox and the hedgehog, can apply to some of the later principles which were included in the fair principles. What I mean by that is that underneath the hood of interoperability and reusability, there are a lot of things that need to happen. In the original fair data principles, reusable, they mention standards, community standards, they mention licenses, they mention provenance. But there are other things which need to happen in the broader system as well. So I think we need to shift a little bit from reusable, viewed by the hedgehog, into all the other things that go into reusability viewed by the fox. I don't know whether that little comparison or analysis helps, but it's some insight into our thinking. So, under reusable, we also need to think about principles of timely release. Some data, in order to have the greatest value, in order to be fair, needs to be released as soon as possible. There can be urgency in some instances for data to be accessible. We need to resist the idea that there should be excessive embargoes for data. Another principle which has been much talked about in other definitions than fair is that of accessibility. How do we know that the data which we're considering using has sufficient quality, that it pertains to the study that we want to use it in, that it's been created on the right sort of machine, etc. Now that information ought to be contained in the community metadata or the provenance metadata, but we think it's such an important idea that it should be mentioned in addition. Also, data needs to be stewarded in the long term, and there are also arguments that we need to have some recommendations for how, for the responsibilities of users when using data. So I want to be crystal clear. We are not for a moment recommending that we should add additional letters to FAIR. FAIR works very well, and so we're resisting this idea of things like suggestions like FAIR TLC, for example, or others to add additional concepts. But what we are saying is that there are significant challenges in implementing FAIR, particularly in relation to interoperability and reusability, and therefore it's part of our task to drill down further beyond the original FAIR principles and to identify these additional concepts which need to be included. Similarly, moving on a little bit more quickly, we explore the broad application of FAIR, and this is contained in the original principles reasonably well. FAIR does not just apply to research data, it also contains principles and attributes that should apply to metadata, and that's very clearly included in the original principles. It should also apply to any code, software, algorithms which are necessary to understand how the data was created or indeed to reuse the data, and there's many things that might fall into that category. And it applies beyond the digital world. We're using a very broad definition of data, which might be analogous to sources or evidence for research. And that includes, therefore, analog data or physical objects, which have detail and metadata around them, but are actually themselves perhaps biological extracts or archaeological items. FAIR should apply to these and the metadata around them as well. So I'll move on now to sections 2 and 3 in our report, which Sarah's also already very much introduced as having a degree of codependency, two sides of the same coin, if you like, or the yin and the yang. We wanted to be very clear that in the report and in the action plan, we would not start off with the F and then the A and then the I and look at what needs to be done for each of these items. We wanted to step back and take a more systemic view of the changes that are necessary, or the recommendations that need to be made for the science system, for the research system, in order to adapt to FAIR and in order to make FAIR data reality. And that leads to from our analysis to the conclusion that we very much needed to discuss culture and technology hand in hand as two very related components or two very related aspects of the science and research system, and areas where there was necessary need for recommendations and change in order to achieve FAIR. So I'll deal first with the responsibilities and the requirements and the recommendations towards research communities. Now in this section, in discussing research communities and then technology and then training and then the metrics, I'm going to give some indication of the sort of recommendations that we're making. Now in the chapter on research communities, we explore we give some examples of research communities that through their practice, through agreement within that community, have moved to a place where data sharing and the effective management of data is very effective, at least for a part of their activity. We give some examples of this and we explore the whys and wherefores and some of of how that came into being. And we've got some case studies in the report as well to give these examples. And so one of the clear recommendations that will come out in the report is that it's important to learn from these examples, to learn why in given research communities such steps were taken, where they were effective, where they might have failed, and to what sort of data they apply within a given research community, because in some instances they don't apply to all the data that a given research community might use. And above all, that it's essential to develop enabling mechanisms that support research communities themselves to develop and implement FAIR data frameworks. What are those mechanisms? What are those principles of self-governance? What are the principles, policies and practice by which that communities can adopt in order to move their practice towards FAIR? And so we explore those and make some recommendations along those lines. These sort of enabling mechanisms include, as I said, the sharing of case studies, mechanisms to encourage and facilitate the development of community agreements for FAIR practices. So we have a number of historical examples where that's come about, from the astronomy community, from the genomics community, and people may be aware of a contemporary initiative relating to FAIR data by the geophysical community, led by the American Geophysical Union. So these are good examples of how communities have come together to change their practice and to encourage the better communication of usable research data. And we will also make a recommendation in relation to mechanisms to encourage and facilitate the development of domain and interdisciplinary standards, with particular attention to the requirement of standards at different levels, whether that's the collection level or the value level concepts, and in relation to provenance information. There we're slipping a little bit into the requirements of interoperability, but it's very important to stress the role of research communities in such processes and the primordial need for international collaboration around the development of those standards and the need for mechanisms which facilitate that international collaboration. Now, in moving on to the discussion of the technical ecosystem which is necessary to make fair data a reality, I want to step back a little bit again and consider many of the discussions that have gone on around FAIR and the FAIR principles hitherto, and try and distinguish that a little bit from the approach that we're taking in this report. I don't think it's entirely unfair, while recognizing the remarkable work that the originators of the FAIR concept principles did and the subsequent discussions, to suggest that the approach has been somewhat data-centric, in the sense that a lot of the principles and the recommendations, you read through them and then you say, okay, this is what I, as a researcher, need to do to my data such that it will be fair. And I want to be clear that that's extremely useful from the perspective of a researcher or a research group, etc. So your data needs to have a permanent identifier, or a persistent identifier rather. It needs to have metadata. It needs to, the code, etc., needs to be made available. There are various things, in addition, in the FAIR principles that go into making data fair. That's very useful. And I try on the right-hand side of that diagram to sort of indicate at least some of those attributes. But if we step back and we're asked, as this expert group has been, to make recommendations on how to make fair data a reality, we can't just talk about those things. We need to take a systemic approach. And so from the perspective of a technical ecosystem, there is a list of functions and providers of those functions which need to be in place and need to operate effectively together. And our analysis in the report offers a list which we think is relatively complete, but may not be entirely comprehensive, and goes thus. One of the key features of the components of a FAIR ecosystem is that the components are things about which there can be a registry or an accessible catalog. So registries of these components and of these services play an important role. But then we need at least to have policies and protocols, to have data management plans, to have persistent and unique identifiers, to have catalogs of standards and reporting protocols and ontologies, to have repositories, and that those repositories should be trusted and should be certified. So we're back there to policies and protocols, and that we should have accessible catalogs and repositories of automated workflows, etc., etc. Now, at the moment, one of the work in progress is how best to express that, not just in the body of the report, but as recommendations, and also how to communicate that in a diagram. So what you're seeing in front of you is really very much a work in progress, and is something that we're working on in the last 6 weeks of the report. But I hope I've given some flavour of what we're trying to do there. And something that we'll do in the report and in that final diagram is try and communicate the interrelatedness of those various components. One of the key components is trusted digital repositories, which I've mentioned. So I'm now moving on into the last 3 substantive areas of the report that I'm going to talk about: trusted digital repositories, skills and training, and the metrics. And in each of these slides, I'll just give a flavour and indication of the sort of discussion and the recommendations. So in the report, we discuss and argue that fair data must be making fair data a reality. For a fair data system to operate effectively, one of the key components upon which it rests is an ecosystem of trusted digital repositories. And that term repositories is relatively broad and covers very specific database or domain data repositories or generic data repositories, and repositories which don't just provide access to data but provide a host of services around those data as well. And there, moving into from that discussion into the sort of recommendations that we will make, is that in order for that ecosystem to develop more effectively, data repositories should be incentivized, supported, and funded to make the necessary steps towards accreditation. The emergence of Core Trust Seal as a minimal standard for repository accreditation is, in our view, a very good thing. But repositories will need considerable help in achieving even that minimal standard. And so the system as a whole needs to work to assist that, because the repositories play such an important role. So mechanisms need to be developed to ensure that the ecosystem as a whole is fit for purpose, not just assessed, that assessment is not just performed on a per repository basis. We don't, I think it's fair to say that we don't often look enough at how the system as a whole works. There are not enough views of the gaps in repository provision. We're often concerned that a given research community has a need either to deposit its data in a given place or for a data service that provides access to a given type of data. But we don't necessarily look at this holistically and consider our gaps. And that sort of process, analogous to the ESRI process, which is strategic, which looked at the requirements for research infrastructures for particular domains, that needs to be ongoing, but look specifically at data provision. And we need to think about, in that context, sustainability, as I say, the strategic provision of data resources, and also what happens when we find that an expensive data resource, although valuable and part of the record of science, is no longer providing a great deal of current service. What are our handover and end-of-life processes? Just to be clear, I'm not advocating the abandonment of those data, but we may find, and we will often find ourselves in situations where we need to hand over the data for safekeeping, but mothball the service as such. Moving on to skills and competencies, this is something which has been stressed in a number of reports and is of considerable interest and need for the research community as a whole, as well as providing and improving the data skills of all researchers. I think it's clear that we need quite urgently to take steps to develop two cohorts of professionals who support research, who support fair data. And we make a distinction in the report in analysing the sort of, briefly and building on other work, the sort of skills and competences required, but between these two sort of roles, they may be embodied in one and the same person, but it's useful to analyse them as two different roles. Those data science skills, so the analytical skills, the statistical skills, the skills in developing data analysis and knowing what sort of questions we can ask of data. So that on the one hand, those data scientists and the data stewards who are skilled in data management and in how the data can be looked after, at least in the project life cycle, it can be handed over to a trusted digital repository, or who have the long-term digital preservation skills as well. Those two cohorts, those two skill sets need to be developed. And then how, and as Sarah said, in the report, in each chapter we have our discussion, our analysis, we make high-level recommendations, and then we describe specific actions. So as an example of the sort of recommendation and then actions that we would make in relation to skills and competencies, there needs to be a concerted effort to coordinate, systematize, and accelerate the pedagogy for these two cohorts, as well as for researchers. And then how do we do that? Well, examples might be actions to promote the sharing of curriculum frameworks and open educational resources. A train the trainers program, which is possibly the most efficient way that these sort of activities can be funded. And as for digital repositories, a lightweight program of certification and endorsement for organizations delivering that training. So just examples of the sort of recommendations and actions which we're likely to include there. Similarly, for metrics, rewards, and recognition, it is clear that there's a lot of work already going on about metrics in relation to FAIR. People are very concerned, institutions, researchers are very concerned, how can I say that my data is fair? How can I demonstrate that this institution has the wherewithal to make data fair? And clearly, with any set of attributes like this, with any quality standards, any approach, we do need metrics. But I think we should have learnt enough lessons over the last 50 years in academia that metrics can have unintended consequences. And so the way in which metrics are designed needs to take and needs to think through the potential unintended consequences to the greatest degree that's humanly possible. We certainly need those, and therefore to ensure that metrics and their application and their response need to be monitored and regularly updated. Certification and evaluation endorsement schemes are clearly needed. And to give an indication of how they should operate, at the very least, they should encourage and reward and recognize that making data available, that making data fair is an important contribution, an important part of scientific activity. So the metrics and reward system should recognize that. And at the very least, for example, be included in the directives or the policies of journal editorial boards or research communities. One way or another, we need to ensure that the creation, the publication in the sense of making public of fair data is a responsibility of researchers and research groups and should be recognized as a fundamental contribution to knowledge and science, as well as research articles and all the other things that are recognized. So, very quickly, because I think I've spoken for quite a long time about the emerging recommendations. Where next? Here's the timescale. This is just a reminder of the timescale that Sarah's already run through. We'll submit the interim report to the Commission, and it'll be released end of May, early June. Well, it'll be launched at the EOS Summit in the 11th of June. We'll conduct consultation activities over the summer, as well as the workshop at the EOS Summit, and we're planning, in all likelihood, to repeat the webinar approach that we did previously. When consultation is over and feedback is taken into account, and the final version of the report will be released in November as part of the, and will be launched as part of the Austrian presidency. So how and where to engage with us? The EOS Summit is the 11th of June, as already mentioned. Françoise Geneva will be presenting at the EARG, the Infrastructure Reflection Group meetings in Sofia, and there's a link there to that program. So there'll be an opportunity to discuss this with Françoise there. We do plan further webinars about the interim report, probably in the second half of June or the first half of July, or both. And we'll be considering those dates. And it's also worth stressing that a number of the people inputting into the report are involved with organisations like the Research Data Alliance, like CODATA. those two organizations are collaborating on International Data Week, which is taking place in Gaborone, Botswana in November, and there'll be a session and other activities around fair data as a whole at that meeting, taking very much a global and international perspective. And this is really the last slide to invite your feedback, not just on what we've said and the content, the substantive part of what we said, but also on the process and the next steps. We're very keen to have your feedback, input and suggestions on what you need by way of consultation. There will be consultation through the Commission's mechanisms, through the summit and webinars. Are there any other mechanisms and channels that people would appreciate? When we ran input webinars last year, we had GitHub. We used GitHub and had various categories in that which people contributed to. I think we're minded to do that again, but we'd like suggestions on how that's run and how useful that is. And it would be possible to run face-to-face workshops as well. We do have a remit and a potential possibility, time permitting, to do that. With which communities is it important to have input into this process between now and the release of the final version of the report? And of course, in terms of its implementation. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand over to the chairs for any questions.
Thank you very much, Simon and Sarah, for this excellent and high-density content presentations. Floor is open for questions. There was one comment coming in, but to start with, what would be sort of first 3 concrete priorities for FAIR from the top of your head, Simon, to move forwards? You covered a lot of ground. What would be sort of the top 3 priorities to move forward immediately?
Okay, good question. Certainly the training. I would also add to that. I mean, so I think the training is in order to move forward and to achieve that vision. Training takes a high priority. I think the infrastructure, the blueprint for the infrastructure ecosystem, or the technical ecosystem rather, is important. I think there are important components there, but I think over the next period of time, we're still working on timescales, but over the next 5 years, considerable progress can and should be made there. And I think the third is and I'm not necessarily delivering this in the order actually, because in the report we place a great deal of emphasis upon the social dimensions, the cultural dimensions, and I think the role of particular research communities, whether in traditional disciplines or in interdisciplinary research areas, in reviewing their practice and reviewing their culture and adopting principles and policies around FAIR is really important. In the end, it's that which makes the most difference. And although that might be slow because it's human and it requires agreement, it is that which makes that achieves the most change in the long run.
Okay. Several questions, comments, remarks come in. I just picked one of them. To the audience, we will try to answer all questions that come into this group. John Petters is saying, do you have some first thoughts on how we might assess the repository ecosystem as fit for enabling fair data, e.g. not at the individual repository level?
Yeah. So again, good question, and it's certainly something that needs to be done. I mean, we need to be clear as well that our role in this report is to be fairly high level, to deliver a high-level strategy, not necessarily to drill down into particular design of an intervention like that. Though I think on that particular one, because it is important, we have and we will make some suggestions. One is about scope, so it's about the extent to which research areas, which research communities are being left out. Another is about process, and this is probably the most important. It's not for us to say these are the priority research areas that need to be addressed, but it is for us to say that at the Commission level, at the European level, at the national level, we do need regular reviews to ensure, A, that there's sufficient spread of provision, and that the right sort of data are being delivered in the right sort of way, that the data that are being delivered conform effectively to the FAIR principles, and that the right data services are being provided. The only way to find that out specifically is to have consultation processes with research communities. Those consultation processes need to be conducted, and there needs to be continual open debate about that provision.
Yeah. Then I have a question for both Simon and for Sarah. Do you have a view on where libraries are in the ecosystem, how they fit in, and specifically with respect to training? Question is for Sarah then. What could libraries do? What would be the first priorities for libraries in terms of training and skills and competencies? But first to Simon, how do you see the libraries in the whole ecosystem?
So you said first to Sarah and then first to Simon. So
no, it's two questions. First question is more global, general in terms of how do you see where do you see the position of libraries in the ecosystem? And then to Sarah, what does this mean concrete? What are priorities in terms of training for libraries?
Okay. So if I understood that correctly, so I'll take the first part of that then. There are many types of libraries, but if we're talking about university research libraries or national libraries, I clearly see that they have a fundamentally important role. The role of libraries on campus as the agency in a university and in the research system that looks after knowledge is evolving. It needs to evolve. It needs to evolve radically and quickly, and it needs to encompass research data. So I see a primordial and fundamental role for research libraries in that process. That's quite challenging. It needs an evolution of library information science skills. But we see that beginning to happen at least. But I think if that evolution doesn't happen, then we have a real challenge, and libraries will be sidelined by other providers of data services.
Clear. Okay. Sarah?
Yeah, and in terms of the skills, I mean, I think it's in multiple ways. So Simon stressed that our report is looking at both research skills as well as the kind of data stewardship skills. Repositories, have a role in both of these, both supporting research communities to develop their skills, but also, if they're running repository services, curating data long-term to act as data stewards. I'll actually kind of plug this in slightly to a question that Susanna raised, where she says, what are we doing in terms of making FAIR reality? How are we engaging with existing efforts? Are we going to make a list of them? We don't have a specific list within the report, but in the action plan we are, the report itself stresses that we need to build on what's already there. We need to look at good practice and replicate that. And where there are existing initiatives, either certain services or things like the Core Trust Seal that Simon's flagged, we will point to those specifically and say this is a model that we recommend using, or this is an approach. So in terms of the training side, we've picked up on things. Now the name's just escaped me, but the fellowship program that CLEAR have as one model that works very well at skills transfer. And there are things like the data stewards role at TU Delft. I think where there are models like that that work well, it's good to build off those.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. One other question that comes up is that, okay, Simon, you said it's not our aim to add another character to the FAIR acronym, but here someone is saying that why not add the O, making FAIR more closer to the 5 stars principle, where open is the first star.
But FAIR doesn't mean open. So, I think that's one of the big issues we have there.
Yeah. I mean, the considered view of the expert group and what will be in the report is that it would be damaging to the effectiveness of FAIR as a means of communicating an important set of principles to add additional letters. And I tried, I tried to explain this as clear as possible in what I said. So we're very resistant to that, but we recognise that additional detail and other concepts do need to be articulated, particularly in relation to open. And the Commission's approach, as open as possible, as closed as necessary, and FAIR, is a very clear and effective way of communicating this, and we don't want to mess with that at all. But we will discuss, and we do discuss in the report, that to achieve interoperability and reusability in particular, we need to consider a broader ecosystem and a whole set of other concepts which support that. That doesn't reduce the significance of FAIR, and this is what I was trying to drive at with my rather long-winded analogy to the hedgehog and the fox. If we stick with the hedgehog, interoperable and reusable, we only explain so much. If we learn from the fox and say there's lots of things we need to know about the I and the R, then we can make FAIR data reality.
Yeah, very well.
And I think, just to go to Alessandro's comment, I think one thing that we really should draw out of that 5 stars is the fact that it's a scale. So when we're talking about FAIR and we're talking about openness, we're encouraging people to be as fair as possible and as open as possible. But the two aren't a one-to-one analogy, and I think we've got to be careful about stressing that data can be fair and can be really reusable without being fully open, because there are sometimes conditions on the access that need to be put in place. But we're encouraging people to kind of go to the higher levels of both of those scales, so to be as open as they can be, but to also be fair.
Okay. Last question. Where is FAIR the impact of FAIR most clearly felt already? Where do you see the impact of FAIR data most clearly? Which disciplines, for example?
So we.
Who do you want to take that off?
To both of you, if you from your experience.
Do you want to go, Sarah?
Yeah, I can make a start, and you can chip in. So I mean, obviously, in the life sciences, it's where the FAIR concept has emerged from. But one of the things we stressed at the start of the report is that there are other principles that align with FAIR and have emerged earlier that are addressing similar things. And we use some case studies in the report looking at areas like linguistics data or astronomy and the building of the virtual observatory there to show that similar practices have emerged in different domains. And FAIR is a really nice way of articulating them, and this is why we're very careful to make sure we stick with that acronym, because it's meaningful and has gained a lot of traction. But there are various research communities that have already got FAIR data practices. And I think, I mean, for me, one of the key recommendations in our report is this fact that we need to enable communities to develop the practices that work for their given types of data and their the ways in which they work, their workflows and their research practices. But we need to enable them to do that in a way that is also interoperable across disciplines. So you don't have all of these different disciplinary silos. We do it in a way that enables data to be shared.
Yes, thank you.
So I think I'd add to that in terms of the impact. It's really in moving the debate forward and in moving the policy circumstances forward. FAIR didn't come from nowhere. It built explicitly, and we didn't present this in the presentation today, but we do so in the report. It built explicitly on the OECD Declaration 2007, on previous European Commission arguments about open data, in specifically upon the list of attributes that came out of the Royal Society report that were adapted and incorporated into the G7 Science Minister's statement, and then were then adopted verbatim by the European Commission's data policy in 2013. That approach of identifying attributes was started there. What FAIR did was communicate them a lot more effectively with a rhetorically useful acronym, and it's very much moved the discussion forward. The fact that people are paying attention to this, that we're investing in infrastructure, and that the FAIR principles are being adopted by funders and by research communities, I think has really lent power to the elbow of those who want to see research data used more effectively in research.
Thanks very much for these explanations, in addition. I'm going to close the webinar now. Simon, Sarah, thank you again very much for joining us today. In addition, we would like to thank the LIBER office for their assistance in running the webinars, and we look forward to further editions. Recordings of the webinar will soon be made available on the LIBER website, and there will be a follow-up on the questions and answers that you posed today. Hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
And Sarah.
Thanks.
And all the audience.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.